Today, we're diving into a really profound tension within the Catholic Church, the clash between its core teaching on universal human dignity and its long-held doctrines on gender. And our guide for this exploration is a fascinating source document called Dignitas Omnium. So, to set the stage, just look at this incredibly powerful statement from Pope Francis. He calls modern gender theory the ugliest danger of our time. He's framing it as this attempt to erase what he sees as God-given differences between men and women. This quote really is the anchor for the official Vatican position in this entire debate. And that leads us straight to the central paradox, right? The Church passionately, and I mean passionately, defends the dignity of every single person. So the question is, how does that core belief coexist with doctrines that create very real distinctions and limitations based on gender? All right, so to unpack this, we're going to move through 5 key areas. We'll start with that core paradox of dignity versus doctrine. Then we'll deconstruct the key concepts of gender, look at feminism's long history with the Church, get into the human rights standoff, and finally explore some proposals for reform that are coming from within. So, let's jump into Section 1, the core conflict. The source document Dignitas Omnium really frames this as a fundamental paradox. You have the Church, a global champion of human dignity, and yet its own internal laws, especially around who can hold office, seem to completely undermine that very principle. It's a real puzzle. Now, to really grasp the arguments on both sides, we absolutely have to get our terms straight. So in Section 2, we're going to deconstruct how the source material defines the key concepts: sex, gender, and gender identity. Getting these definitions down is essential for understanding the rest of this debate. First up, biological sex. This refers to the physical characteristics we're born with: chromosomes, hormones, anatomy. But what's really interesting is that the source document itself points out that even this isn't a simple binary. It actually cites chromosomal variations like Klinefelter or Turner syndromes, showing that biological diversity is a scientific reality. Okay, next we have social gender. This is all about the roles and expectations that society places on us based on our perceived sex. The source material grounds this idea in those famous words from the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born a woman, one becomes one. The point is that femininity and masculinity are shaped by our culture, not just our biology. And finally, there's gender identity. This is a person's internal, deeply felt sense of their own gender. It's about who you know yourself to be, which may or may not line up with the sex you are assigned when you were born. So these 3 concepts together, sex, gender, and gender identity, they really form the framework for this whole modern discussion. You know, this thinking didn't just appear overnight. This timeline does a great job of showing the intellectual journey. It really kicks off with de Beauvoir in 1949, gets sharpened by Anne Oakley in the 70s, and then, wow, it gets radicalized by Judith Butler in 1990, who saw gender not as something you are, but something you do, a performance. Then it was expanded by Kimberly Crenshaw, who showed us how gender intersects with all our other identities, like race and class. So in Section 3, we're going to see how these evolving ideas fueled feminism, which in turn began to challenge the traditional, deeply embedded structures of the Catholic Church. This history is just vital for understanding the tensions that exist today. The source breaks this history down into 4 really distinct waves. The first wave was all about fighting for basic civil rights. Then the second wave, starting in the 60s, was about personal liberation, and that's when feminist theology really emerged, directly questioning things like male-only language for God and, of course, male-only leadership. The third wave introduced intersectionality, and that's when the Vatican started to push back hard, coining the term gender ideology. And the fourth wave? Well, that's what we're living through now. Digital activism like #MeToo inspiring movements inside the Church for accountability and equality. This brings us to the absolute heart of the conflict in Section 4, a direct standoff between the Church's own legal code and the principles of universal human rights. This is where the theological debate becomes a very real legal and ethical confrontation. And you really can't get any clearer than this. On the left, Canon Law 1024 states, without any ambiguity, that only a baptized man can be ordained. On the right, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all people are born free and equal, period. No distinctions based on sex. The contradiction is just, it's stark. The source uses a really powerful and, frankly, disturbing metaphor to describe the situation. It calls it a mine crime. The idea is that the Church's special legal status acts like a hidden landmine. It's buried under tradition and theology, but when the principle of universal rights steps on it, it explodes, completely negating those rights within the Church's domain. So the crucial point the source is making is this. Yes, religious freedom is a fundamental right. But, and this is a huge but, it cannot be used as a shield to justify discrimination. It draws a very clear line between protecting personal faith and protecting institutional practices that violate basic human rights. So, where do we go from here? That's the big question, isn't it? Well, our final section explores the potential path forward. Because despite this massive standoff, the source highlights these powerful movements and bold proposals that are actually emerging from within the church, all aiming to bridge this divide. A key example is the Maria 2.0 movement in Germany. And just look at their demands. They're not just asking for women to have access to all offices. They're also calling for the end of compulsory celibacy, for real justice in abuse cases, and for a sexual morality that actually reflects people's lives. It's a holistic vision for a completely reformed church. Building on this kind of energy, the source document puts forward its own radical, concrete proposal: a new foundational law for the church. It's called Lex Dignitatis Omnium, which translates to the law on the dignity of all. And the goal is to formally embed the principles of universal human rights into the very constitution of the church itself. And this just brilliantly illustrates the change. On the left, the law as it stands. On the right, the proposed law. It's a simple yet absolutely revolutionary change of just a few words, from only a baptized man to any baptized person. This single edit would fundamentally transform the church's entire stance on equality. And so we end where we began, with this one profound question. The source material has laid out the conflict, the history, and a potential path forward. But it leaves us to wonder, can an institution that's built on millennia of tradition truly reconcile its doctrines with the modern understanding of human rights? Can dignity and doctrine finally become one?